Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Environmental Inspections in England. I'm Ellie Savage, I'm a Policy Officer at the IES and I'll be hosting the webinar today. So a quick bit of housekeeping to start us off. Your cameras and microphones should be automatically switched off, but please do feel free to put any comments, or if you're having any technical issues, for instance, please do put those in the chat. As always, there'll be a chance for questions at the end of the presentation, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at any point during the presentation. I will then ask these on your behalf later. Using the Q&A option means that others can vote on your questions, so it's really helpful for me because I can see which questions are the most popular. So if you can use that, that's great. This webinar is being hosted by the Environmental Policy Implementation Community, or EPIC. Oh, I'm hearing that Peter has no sound. Is anyone else having issues with sound? Oh, well, they wouldn't hear me put it in the chat. I'm going to anticipate that it's only an issue with Peter. Sound is fine. Thank you, David. Okay, Peter, great. Thank you, everyone. I'll respond to Peter in the chat after I've done my introduction. Yeah, so this webinar has been hosted by EPIC. I'll pop some links in the chat in a sec. So if you want to find out more about EPIC, then you can do so. But just to let any kind of local authority officers in the room know that you're all able to join EPIC for free. So I'd really recommend checking it out, especially if you are a local authority officer. And we also have our annual conference coming up on the 13th of October, so it's a really great time to join us. But on to the topic at hand, this webinar will explore the new Environmental Inspections in England report from the Office for Environmental Protection. And we're really delighted to have two of the report's authors joining us today. We were supposed to have also one of the other report's authors, Alex Golding. Unfortunately, she's unable to join us due to illness. But to introduce our two speakers, first of all, William Wilson is a barrister and principal lawyer with the OEP's Legal Research and Analysis team. He has worked on environmental law in government, private practice and consultancy, and is the author of Making Environmental Laws Work, Law and Policy in the UK and USA, and has worked on environmental and energy law projects in the UK, EU and internationally. And he has also been a member of EPIC's advisory group. And also we have joining us today Rob Dennis, who's a lawyer at the OEP's Legal Research and Analysis team. Rob has worked at the OEP since 2023, conducting legal research and providing advice on matters involving a wide range of environmental laws. Prior to his time at the OEP, Rob worked in private practice, specialising in commercial property law. So without any further ado, I will hand over now to William.
Hey, thank you very much indeed to Ellie and also to EPIC for the chance to talk to you today about our Environmental Inspections in England report. We may be a small minority of people in the country, but we're quite excited by it. Because it took lots of work and it came out in July, and here it is. It's very long, but we think it's sort of worthy and important rather than necessarily beach reading, as it were. We're part of the team that produced it, led by Ray Purdy, head of legal research and analysis at the OEP, and with my other colleague who's not able to be here today, Alex Golding. Can we have the first slide, please, Rob?
No problem, Will. Here they come.
Sorry?
Here they come, Will. Hopefully,
there we go. Thank you very much. That's great. So this is the report that it's about, and it's to do with environmental inspections based in England, and it's based on 10 case studies on selected laws and their implementation. We share with EPIC a lively interest in the effectiveness of implementation of environmental law. And that's one of the things that most interested me about the choice of the name and the choice of the priorities for your new group. Should we have another look at the next slide, please? So why look at inspections? We're reminded that inspection systems constitute an integral and essential component of regulatory systems. As most of you as practitioners already know, they serve many purposes. They prevent non-compliance, they detect non-compliance. They're an opportunity to give advice on compliance and best practice from regulators, and they offer insight into effectiveness of regulatory regimes. Indeed, one of the 5 or 6 external reviewers of this report put it to us like this: if none of us had to have our tax returns checked, how many of us would comply with the requirements that they contain? So can we have the next slide? One of our recommendations this year on the government's environmental implementation plan was that government regulate more effectively, and that the OEP noted that monitoring and evaluation is becoming more important than ever as a way to understand what's working and when to change course to ensure outcomes are achieved effectively. But we became aware very early on in preparing this report that there's been very little recent public examination by Parliament, by government, by academics, perhaps more by academics, but less by government and Parliament, and very little by the regulators themselves, of what inspections take place and how effective they are. So there's a certain lack of evidence as to whether inspections are actually delivering the outcomes expected by government. You have the next one. We very much echo the view of the House of Lords Industry and Regulators Committee. There's a really important report which we drew on a lot, Who Watches the Watchdog, in 2024. It's difficult to assess whether a regulator has been sufficiently monitoring or enforcing compliance, and if this is having a positive impact. And we echo also the views of the National Audit Office that DEFRA had limited data on the effectiveness of environmental regulation to inform decisions about future activities and where to prioritize resources. Next one. So the general approach that we took to this was to have an initial look at 198 environmental laws, focusing on the provisions that governed or related to compliance inspection. In some cases, the duties that we found in those laws were quite specific, of the sort that's given here. The authority must carry out an inspection no later than 1 year from the date of the immediately previous inspection. A routine inspection must include an examination of this, that, and the other. So that's what we call a specific provision. But non-specific provisions of the sort that Rob's referred to in this later slide were much more common. And we identified a lot of those. So you get provisions like the regulator must make appropriate periodic inspections. It should be the duty of every local authority to cause its area to be inspected from time to time. A permitting authority must undertake such inspections as it considers appropriate. The appropriate agency must undertake visual inspections at the frequency necessary, and so on. Next one. So what's going on in that sort of provision? I seem to have lost the slides there, but not sure whether you have. If we could come back to that slide. What's happening with those sort of high-level general provisions is that environmental regulators are being given a high degree of discretion as to how they undertake inspections. Are we back on the slides, Rob, or not? No.
Oh, sorry, Rob. Can you not see the slides at the moment?
No, I can't at the moment. I don't know whether other people can.
I can see the slides, so
okay, that's fine.
It looks like they're on our approach legislative review.
That's fine. That's fine. So what those general provisions tell you is really that regulators are being given a very big degree of discretion how they undertake inspections from time to time, with the frequency that they seems appropriate to this. And to some extent, there's a logic to that, because regulators are likely to be the ones who have most information about the regulated entities' operations and are best placed to assess how to go about it. But that does have implications for matters such as accountability, transparency, and resourcing. And we'll come on to that in the recommendations that Rob's going to deal with. Because if you give regulators that much discretion, who do they have to report to? How transparent are their operations? And, are they giving enough information to justify the resources that they may need in order to carry out their operations effectively? So in looking at this, we approached this by taking on 10 case studies. Can I have that slide, please? Hope I do, but I don't see it. That's it. And they are very briefly, for local authorities, we had two case studies on statutory nuisance and on their regulation of small waste incinerators. We looked at the HSE's control of genetically modified organisms and contained use. We looked at 4 studies for the Environment Agency on water abstraction, on paper and textiles, T11 waste exemptions and bathing water, highly contrasting studies. Aquaculture production businesses by the Fish Health Inspectorate, marine licenses by the Marine Management Organization, and invasive non-native species by the Animal, Plant and Health Agency and the Non-Native Species Inspectorate. If I can go on to just take 2 instances of those from local authorities. The first one is local authorities statutory nuisance. Are we on that one?
We are.
Thank you. So just as an instance, we looked at the duty, in particular the duty in section 79(1) of the Environmental Protection Act 1990 for local authorities to inspect their areas from time to time for statutory nuisance. And we quite quickly came up against the fact that nearly a quarter of the local authorities who responded to us said that they didn't do that at all. So whatever the law said, they just simply didn't do it. I think 1 or 2 of them said something to the effect of it wasn't a good use of their resources. So that immediately raised the issue for us. I mean, of course, we understand that local authorities have 101 other things that they're supposed to be doing, and this may not be the end of the world as we know it, because they're not carrying out their functions under section 79(1) of the Environmental Protection Act, but it does raise a question for the validity and application of environmental laws, which was significant to us. And where inspections were conducted, approaches to the inspections varied widely, and only 17 local authorities who undertook proactive inspections, or said they did, were able to provide figures as to the number of inspections they carried out. So again, we're coming up against the lack of data, the lack of monitoring, the lack of readily available information about what inspections are carried out, how, when, under which powers, and so on. And many local authority respondents integrated those inspections with inspections under other regimes. So it's very difficult for them to say, we did these under section 79(1) of the EPA 1990, and this number of inspections under other powers. We just have a look at a contrasting case study, the local authority's small waste incineration plants. Have we got that one?
Yeah.
Thank you. On average, permits received 1.05 in-person inspections per year across all inspection types, but 16% of the permits about which we received information hadn't received an in-person inspection over a 1-year period. And the data available didn't enable us to precisely quantify the contribution of remote inspection activities, but they appeared to play a limited role. Some local authorities indicated that subsistence fees did not meet their costs. Relevant guidance appeared to be out of date, quite significantly out of date and quite misleading in some cases. And information on the implementation or performance of the regulatory regime on a national level has become harder to access. Those were particularly features of local authority case studies, but they were not alone in that, because we found similar issues, as you'll hear in other case studies. One point that we would like to ask you about in the questions, I think, is we undertook a contact exercise with nearly all the local authorities that we could contact individually. We encountered a range of issues and challenges with doing that, and we would like to explore with you and discuss with you, particularly with your EPIC local authority experience, how we might approach that differently and how we might do that more effectively in a future similar case. Is anything you'd like to add to that, Rob? Otherwise, I'll hand over to Rob to continue the canter through where we got to in the report, and then have some questions.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, happy to pick it up from here. Yeah, on the point about engaging with local authorities, obviously we are conscious that some of you actually on this call may have been on the receiving end of our information requests on this. So any kind of input that you can offer really about sort of how we can best engage with local authorities on work like this would be really, really appreciated. We certainly learned a lot from this process, but I think there's probably a lot more wisdom we can glean from you too. So if you could hold those thoughts though for the end, that'd be much appreciated. So yes, as Will said, we went through the whole process of reviewing this wide range of laws and looking at these case studies, and we drew a number of findings out of these, and from those we put together a series of recommendations, and in total the report makes 8 recommendations. Now in the report itself, we don't actually kind of put them under subheadings in the way I'm going to do in these slides. It just makes it a bit easier for the purpose of talking about them. So I'm going to group them under essentially the headings of guidance, transparency, inspection practice, resourcing and financing, and scrutiny and oversight. So our first recommendation, which falls under guidance, guidance is of course a good thing. It helps the regulated community and the wider public understand what should be expected. It also helps regulators know what is required of them, and it helps them to plan their environmental inspection tasks. But as Will sort of suggested already with regards to local authorities, we found pretty much across the board actually that a lot of guidance was not particularly detailed or often quite out of date, often wasn't a consolidated piece of guidance that regulators could go to. And I think that actually that was a finding that in some senses was mirrored in the Corrie review too. So our recommendation here is a relatively simple one. It's just that DEFRA needs to put a bit more attention on what's going on with guidance, whether it's up to date, whether it can be enhanced, and not just DEFRA, but all regulators have responsibility for guidance, because there's clearly some improvements that can be made there. Our second and third recommendations relate to transparency. Of course, if good regulation is going to be pursued, it's really important that people, whether that's government or other observers, understand how laws are being implemented in practice. So in the case of inspections, that essentially means what inspections are taking place. What we found, however, when we looked at, for example, public registers, was that it was incredibly rare that they included any information on what sort of inspection or compliance activity was taking place in respect of regulated entities. So essentially one of our recommendations is that this information should be being made more readily available. It was actually quite striking that even when we were going directly to regulators, again, as Will suggested, with regard to some local authority data, it was actually quite hard to get figures. So of course, if that information was being published on a more sort of routine basis, it will probably also be gathered in a more organized way. The third recommendation relates to a relatively sort of specific point. Regulators are already required under the Regulators Code to produce an enforcement policy. That's 6.2b. Under 6.2c, they're required to publish information on their compliance activities, but it's not kind of organized into a single policy in the way that enforcement is. So as a result, although this information on compliance is generally made available, it's often dotted around all sorts of different places, various different web pages and so on. So our recommendation here essentially is that information on compliance checks should really be consolidated into one easy to find place, for example, in the form of a compliance policy, very similar to the way that regulators already publish enforcement policies. Our fourth recommendation relates to inspection practice, although actually thinking about it, maybe saying inspection practice isn't quite the best way of putting it. We're not talking here about on the ground inspection practice, but what an inspector actually does when they go to inspect a site. We're thinking about this in a more high level way. We're looking at the North Star of environmental inspection, and that's really risk-based regulation, the thing that drives and targets inspections on a high level. And of course, the principle there is that if you have a site or an activity that is regarded or determined to be of higher risk to the environment, it's going to receive more compliance scrutiny. And generally what we found in our case studies was that where regulators had attributed higher levels of risk to certain activities or sites, they did then give them higher levels of scrutiny. But at the same time, we certainly had some questions arising through looking at this. So, for example, we found that in quite a few of the regimes we looked at, a very high proportion of sites or activities weren't receiving any scrutiny at all because they had been deemed to be low risk. And actually, I'll just flick forward here. This is a graph that is in the report. Really important to put a caveat on it. There are lots of reasons, and in some cases, good reasons for big variations in the amount of scrutiny that permits or equivalents are receiving. But the point stands that, as you can see from this, the light blue shows that very large proportions in some cases of permits or equivalent actually weren't receiving inspections in a given year. So the question arises, was that intended under risk-based regulation, that you would essentially end up with portions of the regulated community who simply don't get inspected at all? Another question that arose was, to what extent are other factors starting to influence how much scrutiny is being given to certain permits, for example? So, for example, we are really conscious that resourcing is a major issue. To what extent is resource-based regulation starting to influence how much scrutiny is being directed and where it's being directed? Another factor that came up was about actually determining risk. Obviously, risk-based regulation will work really well if you can effectively determine where the risks are greatest. But what we found was that in a couple of our case studies, there were indications that regulators had determined risk around certain sites or activities and targeted their inspections at those. And then subsequently had maybe sort of come to realize that actually that wasn't quite where the risk really lay, and were therefore sort of having to change course. So again, thinking a bit more about that process for how do you determine where the highest risk is. So essentially, what we're sort of focusing on here is we're not saying that there's an inherent issue with risk-based regulation at all. What we're saying is risk-based regulation has been around for quite a long time. It would make a lot of sense for DEFRA and other bodies to take a step back and to sort of look at it on a really wide level and say, is it working in the way it was intended? Are there ways we can enhance it? Are there other factors starting to play in that we weren't intending to play a role in this? So it's really just about taking a big look at risk-based regulation just to make sure it's working as it was meant to. Our fifth recommendation is on resourcing and financing. We're conscious that a substantial proportion of regulatory budgets are spent on activities like inspections, but it was really surprisingly difficult, actually, for us to get clear information on the amounts of money that were being raised and were being spent on inspections and similar activities. And that certainly wasn't because we felt that regulators weren't being open about it. It was often just that the information wasn't collected, or it wasn't collected in a way that then would make it something that could be presented and analysed. So essentially, this recommendation, again, it's a relatively simple one. We are trying to encourage greater sort of transparency on what's going on with the finances here. This is particularly important in cases where the regulated community is being charged for that regulation. You know, it was particularly surprising to us when you had a set of activities where subsistence fees were charged for specific activities. The regulators couldn't always then say what had actually been raised in respect of those subsistence fees and how much of it had then been used for particular purposes and how much had been used for regulating those communities who have been charged. So essentially, more information, more transparency on financing. 6, 7, and 8 all relate to scrutiny and oversight. So one mechanism for scrutinizing law and activities such as inspections, which may be prescribed in laws, are post-implementation reviews. Half of the case studies that we looked at were subject to some sort of post-implementation review requirement, although it should be noted that that's slightly skewed by the fact that everything under environmental permitting regulations gets caught, so that kind of does skew it a little bit. However, what we found was that even when there was a post-implementation review requirement, those post-implementation reviews very rarely gave very much, if any, attention at all to inspections, and that's even where there was a statutory requirement to conduct inspections. And that surprised us, given that inspections are one of the main mechanisms for making sure that the rest of the law actually gets applied and implemented and achieves its goals. So essentially, we're pushing on number 6 for post-implementation reviews to place a bit more focus on inspections where those are required under laws. Recommendation 7 focuses a bit more on DEFRA. We came to the view through this process that DEFRA will benefit from having a better understanding as to whether and how environmental regulation is working. Policy responsibility for inspections is quite dispersed among lots of different policy leads and teams covering lots of different regimes. So what we're trying to encourage through recommendation 7 is a more focused, repeated, coherent approach to reviewing what's going on with environmental inspections from DEFRA to make sure that it's got a really clear understanding of what's going on a big scale. And then finally, recommendation 8. Not entirely dissimilar in a way to recommendation 7, but this one's more about research. We definitely felt that there was a lot more research that could be usefully done to enhance government and DEFRA's understanding of the links between compliance assessment, environmental outcomes, and environmental risks. I'm pretty sure, I think it was the Environment Agency did a report back in 2005 in which they concluded that on all of those points, government's understanding basically wasn't very advanced. And we didn't see a huge amount of evidence that much research had been committed to moving that forward in the years since. So we feel that if that research were conducted, it would allow for a good holistic view on what was going on with inspections, and also for identification of if there are areas of weakness or areas of improvement, and just for coherent development across the DEFRA group. So those are our main recommendations. I've raced through them a bit, so hopefully they did make sense. In terms of our next steps, we are expecting a response to the report from DEFRA in October. And then we are also in the process of finalising another report on inspections. This one, it's related, but not directly linked to the one we're talking about today. And unlike the one we're talking about today, this new one will really drill down into an individual regime. So, as I said earlier, our report that we're talking about today, it wasn't looking at sort of the level of on the ground, it was quite high level. This one will really be zooming in on a particular regime, waste regulation, to actually see really what is going on the ground and how that's working. So we're not quite done with environmental inspections. So that is pretty much it for our presentation. So I'll just stop sharing and I'll hand back to Will in case you have anything you want to add, Will, or anything you think I missed.
Oh, sorry, William, you're on mute.
Yeah, beg your pardon. Sorry. Thank you very much indeed, Rob. Yeah, just to say in terms of next steps, we're continuing to work in parallel, and quite a lot of overlap between the work that we're doing in this area and bodies such as the National Audit Office, the House of Lords Industry and Regulation Committee, Regulatory Policy Committee, and others, including our opposite numbers in Scotland and Wales, the Environmental Standards Scotland and IPAW, the Welsh interim regulator. And we're just finding quite a lot of similarity, quite a lot of overlap, and quite a lot of common ground in the sort of recommendations that Rob has been describing and the sort of things that they're finding. And I think it tends to justify our underlying view that inspections are really important to the practical implementation and monitoring of environmental law, and they just deserve a bit more attention and a bit more scrutiny and time and effort than they've received to date. And the other thing is, if I could just follow up with one question that we very much like to ask you, which is specifically about engagement with local authorities. We were, I think it's fair to say, a bit clunky in the way that we approached this, tried to contact every single local authority, but like a number of organisations, if you don't approach it through the right person at the right desk and so on, you can spend a lot of time toing and froing. And we'd be very interested in your thoughts about how, in a similar exercise in future, we would get to the point with the people who actually deal with environmental issues at local authorities more quickly and more efficiently. So we'd welcome your views on that, because we know there's a lot of experience in that of the EPIC community.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much, William and Rob. I mean, it was a great presentation, really clear. I mean, as someone who has kind of gone through the full length report, it's obviously really helpful as well to have the key points like presented so clearly. So thanks very much for that. And obviously, yeah, just completely aligned with kind of EPIC's mission and almost like thesis of we have this whole environmental regime on paper in the letter of the law. But then when we kind of look at it in practice, and people don't often actually like to look at what is going on in practice, and there's like a few exceptions like obviously your report, and I often think of the Wild Justice report as well, that was released last year, looking at the housing, the obligations, environmental obligations on kind of developers, and if those had actually been taking place, and actually going around practically going to the sites and seeing and taking pictures and seeing what's happened. When you actually do look at that, it's not the same story, and it's often obviously quite worrying. So yeah, thanks very much for that. A reminder to people, please do post questions in the Q&A. I'll start with one as kind of the chair's prerogative, and we will go on to William, as you said, about this question about how can you guys better engage with local authorities, and I have put that in the Q&A, and you guys can respond to that. It's a discussion post, so you can respond to that question if you'd like to answer that. So my question to you two to start off with, obviously there's a lot of, you've presented this is what is going on, these are clearly some of the issues that are happening, and you've got some recommendations to try and deal with those. But have you, when kind of doing the report, have you come across and have you started thinking about, the why those issues there, and what are the barriers? I guess specifically, maybe we could focus on local authorities. What are the barriers to local authorities to conducting adequate inspections? And potentially, are they going to be able to, a lot of the recommendations are maybe kind of DEFRA working in partnership with people, but are those recommendations going to be able to work if maybe some of those barriers aren't addressed first?
Well, I can have a go at that, and then Rob can follow on with any thoughts he's got. I'm sure that resources are a big issue for local authorities in particular, but for all regulators up to a point. And this is actually one of the reasons why we argue for having better data and better collection of data in order to enable regulators, in this case local authorities, to make the case for the resources that they need to carry out the monitoring that is required by the law. If they don't have that data and they can't tell us, what resources are collected, how they're spent, what inspections actually take place and things, it must be correspondingly harder for them to make the case, which is no doubt already difficult within government, for extra resources to do more. So I'm sure that's one area. Also, staffing and adequate skills of staffing is an issue, not just for local authorities, but for all regulators. Salary levels go through to that. And also, that the law is not very specific, as we've touched on, and the guidance is obviously not always hugely helpful and not sort of filling in the gaps and not up to date. So there are things that could be done without large amounts of expenditure, but yeah, ultimately without resources, it's kind of difficult to make progress.
I think sorry to jump in, I'll go back to you a second, Rob, but I just think, that did really jump out to me, that point about in the initial regulations to start with being more specific, because one thing we talk about in EPIC is kind of implementation minded policy, trying to make sure that policy and regulation is implementation minded in the first place. And obviously when you have kind of things like, I don't know, what was it, inspect from time to time, I mean, it's not gonna it's going to be very easy for people to just kind of ignore that commitment. Sorry, Rob, did you have anything to add on that?
Thanks, Ellie. Yeah, just one thing. I mean, I completely agree with everything that Will and you have just said. I think another factor that came up was some of these regulatory regimes have really become very, very complex. It's not always entirely obvious actually what the regulators are meant to do. And one thing that, particularly with local authorities, actually we saw in the statutory nuisance regime was that as other regulatory regimes have grown up around statutory nuisance, they all interact, but the way they interact hasn't necessarily been accounted for within the regulation and the law itself. So with statutory nuisance, we saw an enormous amount of overlap where essentially local authorities said, well, we're responsible for X number of regimes, and actually in a way discharging this regime, we can sort of deal with statutory nuisance through that as well. So you've ended up with in some cases, a very, very complex legislative picture governing these inspection regimes, and that really doesn't help necessarily. So I think that's an additional factor I would point to, just the sheer complexity of some of these regimes that have developed over time.
Yeah, and I feel like that was kind of something coming out of the Corrie review, right? These kind of recommendations to simplify regulation, and well, we'll see. But I feel like every 5 or 10 years there's some kind of big report that says we need to simplify environmental regulation. But it's obviously much easier to add things than to take it away. Great. I'll move on to some of the points in the chat. We've got a comment from David about data. Maybe not so much of a question, but I'll read it out. It might be interesting. So data is collected by DEFRA on environmental permitting regime inspections. The survey has been scaled down / simplified considerably over the years, largely because they wanted to get a better response rate. This suggests that there is no consequence for local authorities who don't respond to the survey. To date, the survey for 2024 has not come out. Still in 2025. Data has not been collected by DEFRA / the Environment Agency on Part 2A for about 15 years. That's Part 2A, I believe, in the Environmental Act, so contaminated land regime. A survey is expected later this year. And then finally, data is collected via annual status reports on local air quality. DEFRA has tried recently to name and shame by maybe letters to chief executives to getting those reports submitted on time, and this has been successful. So yeah, not so much a question from David, but basically trying to explain why data is so hard to come by. I don't know if you guys have any reflections on that.
I would say that chimes very much with, I mean, not the detail, but the general point that we're making about transparency and oversight and scrutiny. We're very much in favour of transparency because we think that the public is in a position to provide sort of active participation where it's given the data to do so. And we're very much in favour of scrutiny by government. So the more government committees and parliamentary committees asking how legislation is being applied in practice and informing themselves on the detail of that, the better as far as we're concerned. Because, I mean, if I cast my time back to being a bill manager for environmental legislation in government, you know, there tended to be a tailing off of interest when you got to the tail end of the bill, and there was a bit about enforcement, but very little about monitoring, very little about sort of the detail of inspections and things like that. And I think what this report is trying to do is to say, actually, it does matter. It does go directly to, it's one of the factors that goes directly to whether these laws are working or not. And the more transparency, the more data, and the more scrutiny can be arranged, probably the better.
Yeah. Rob, sorry, did you have anything on that as well?
No, completely agreed on that. And I think those actual specific examples that were cited, we kind of came across those in our journeys through these case studies as well. I mean, I think what we saw was that over the last few years, that in a way, actually, the level of transparency has sort of slightly slipped. And in some cases, I think there are lots of reasons for that. I think the point about actually trying to encourage greater levels of engagement by maybe asking for less data, but then of course the result is that less data gets published. That's obviously going to be one. We also have seen with some of the regimes that we looked at, some of the kind of data gathering and reporting was dealt with through kind of EU level processes, and some of that has slightly fallen away and maybe not been fully picked up yet. Although actually we found, I think it was the Fish Health Inspectorate case study, that there was a reporting mechanism that had sort of not been repeated since 2019. And then days before we were going to publish the report, all of a sudden it started being published again. So I don't think it's necessarily that all this stuff has just been dropped. It might just be that it's taken a while to kind of reformulate it, as these regimes have changed in some cases as a result of EU exit. But yeah, there are lots of reasons for it. So yeah, I think the data issue is a big one. And that's why several of our recommendations do relate to that. More information that's available, the better.
Yeah, definitely. And we have got a couple more comments on data, a couple from Nick Marks. The principle of better data collection is obviously good. However, if you're mired in dealing with environmental regulation, additional work in more recording is difficult to deliver. And then also another comment from Nick, which is that the environmental health function is often split between multiple teams these days, which makes it much more difficult to collect statistics. So yeah, I think just, adding there to it's a very challenging position.
That's not just a local authority comment,
be...
is it? I mean, it's certainly one that other regulators have made a similar point to us. We don't collect this data by, we collect it by team rather than by function and so on and so forth. So we don't have the data that you're asking for.
Yeah, certainly can't be assumed that the regulator actually structures their activities in the same way that the law frames them. And I think that was definitely something that we took away. We kind of felt that following the law, we then expected almost on the ground the activities to be kind of grouped in the way that they were in the law. And actually in practice, that's not the case. So that's something that we certainly took away from this process too.
I mean, potentially there's going to be a big reorganization coming down the line for local government, and potentially that's an opportunity to try and increase alignment. But I don't know, the more I kind of look into these kind of things, the more of me thinks just, well, a few years later down the line there'll be another type of reorganization, and then if you're constantly trying to align or catch up, then actually what you're doing is constantly changing, and then that can make things even more difficult. So yeah, it's obviously very challenging. I also kind of had another question. Obviously, as you both have said, and as the report is really kind of at the heart of the report, is that conducting thorough inspections, like robust inspections, are really important. But when kind of writing the report and seeing what the situation was, did you kind of think about, are there any alternatives to how we can make inspections work better, as opposed to just trying to make sure that they do actually happen? For instance, like kind of increasing the penalties for non-compliance, so there's more of that kind of that risk and that threat. So hopefully you wouldn't need as many inspections, or kind of going down more like the trying to work with organizations and making sure that there was kind of like voluntary compliance, and you didn't need inspections. Kind of, I guess they're different ends of the scale. But did you kind of consider either of those options in your report as well?
Rob, do you want to have a go at that?
What I would say is we actually considered, when we were first determining the scope of the report, to what extent we would think about kind of how inspections then flowed through to outcomes. And in the end, we kind of decided that it probably would be a bit too much of a reach for us to do that. So we really only focused predominantly on what was actually happening in practice, rather than really drilling down then into kind of how inspections might be conducted differently or so on. We were thinking about it, and it did come up quite a lot. And at one point, for instance, we were thinking of having a chapter on new technologies, for instance, that can be used to try, so we certainly were thinking about it. It wasn't really the main focus of the report at this stage, and we kind of thought it might be a future piece of work almost. This was almost like step one of, I mean, I'm not saying that necessarily, I'm not planning the OEP's future work programs here.
No, I think that's an official launch.
Yes. But yeah, we weren't focusing on that so much really. But it's certainly an incredibly important point to focus on. I don't know if, Will, you've got any particular thoughts on it?
No, I think that the focus on this report, as Rob has said, it was not really to zero in on individual regulators and point the finger and say, you're not doing this, that, and the other. It was really to try and look at the machinery of inspections and to try and gather the facts and try and get a better understanding of what's actually taking place or not taking place. Because you have to start with that in a way to say what else you should be doing. So there is plenty of other aspects or that could be looked at. The report that will be forthcoming in the next few months about the waste inspections in particular will go into much more depth, really, about sort of how that works or doesn't work, and that'll be much more detailed about that particular regime. And our report was sort of going along the top, as it were, and just saying sort of, what do we know about this, and can we ask some basic questions? How many inspections are taking place? How many of them are in person? How many of them remote? How are they financed? What sort of data is available on them, and so on, in order to try and get a view and to read across those 10 case studies and say, are there any common themes coming out of it? And we think there are. We think that the sort of themes that Rob's been talking about, transparency and scrutiny and need for clear and up-to-date guidance and better resourcing and things are fairly common themes, and they are very important, so. But we certainly haven't in this report got to the bottom of every aspect like technology.
No, and I think that makes sense. And like I said at the start, I think there was definitely a gap in just that kind of basic understanding of how environmental inspections, like you say, how many are being carried out, and just the really basic questions like that. So no, it makes sense to not go into those wider questions of, is technology going to save us? Are we going to have some kind of amazing monitoring system where it's going to require like very little capacity? I don't know, I feel like this is coming back to in my head, a lot of this is reflecting on the work on B&G that we've done, and the monitoring and compliance with that is just, the key issue there. I'm going to go to some more questions in the chat. We've got one from Eugene, who says, hi, with all this talk about data and statistics not being a high priority or simply not being analysed enough, do you think there would be a better approach in conducting these inspections? It may just be me thinking this, although there seems to be a little risk to some authorities simply choosing not to partake in surveys without incurring penalties.
Well, it's one of the reasons why we'd quite like to consider better and more effective ways of contacting local authorities. But actually, I suppose technically the OEP is able to ask for information from regulators of environmental laws and to require that answers be given. That said, we didn't get a full response rate, but then that is partly maybe down to us in the way that we approached it, and not focusing sufficiently in the way that we put the questions. But I think in other cases it may become more pressing to know the answers to particular questions, and we might have to press harder in order to get those results. But having sharpened up our own procedures, I think we go to quite a lot of lengths to try and make sure we're not asking questions unnecessarily. We realize public authorities are busy. They have 101 things that they have to do. We try not to ask questions just for the sake of it. But where we do ask them, then we tend to need to.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Just a couple more comments here, which more comments than questions, but I'm just going to read them out and then we'll talk about engaging with local authorities. So Nick mentions that local authority training budgets have been cut to nothing over the years, and while cutting training does not impact on service delivery immediately, he says, but you end up with an elderly workforce. And Nick, I disagree, not like you. Not elderly. And then Laura also flags that there's actually a consultation at the moment about modernising environmental permitting, which seems to overlap with what we're talking about, and has kindly provided the link. So if people haven't seen that, that's in the Q&A. Great. So I'll go on to now the discussion about how you can kind of better engage with local authorities. We've had a few comments relating to that. So David Carr says that the CIH Environmental Protection Advisory Panel would be a good place to start, and also national contaminated land officers groups. EPIC obviously has the National Contaminated Land Officers Group as in like the overall umbrella organisation as kind of their land contamination expert. So if it's specific to land contamination, then they're a really good place to contact. And then there are also regional contaminated land officers groups that operate separately in different parts of the country if you need to kind of have a conversation relating to just one region. And then we also had a comment in the chat from Jonathan Tate saying many local authorities belong to regional groups that focus on specific issues. For example, the Yorkshire Lincolnshire Pollution Advisory Group, which is actually also one of the contaminated land regional groups, I believe. Either that's a subgroup of YALPAG or they mainly focus on that issues, and that they might be a good gateway into numerous local authorities who will then discuss the issues and provide a response. So yeah, some suggestions there. And obviously I'd say as kind of like the EPIC officer, obviously EPIC community is also a really good way to speak to local authorities, especially those who are interested in environmental implementation, because I mean we are a group of people who are interested in these issues. So you might get a kind of better response rate, and we do sometimes run kind of workshops and things looking at issues. We held one last month looking at issues about kind of how to overcome politicization or difficulties with resources or communication when you're trying to implement. And yeah, our members are often very happy to kind of like engage with these things. So yeah, definitely I would suggest EPIC as a good point of call as well. I hope that's helpful. I don't know if you guys have any follow-up questions on that.
I think it's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed for those sort of practical suggestions. I'm sure there's things we would try and do more efficiently next time through, especially on the communications with local authorities area. And you do it on a particular way, but I'm sure there's always ways you can do it better.
Yeah.
Particularly with more of a lead-in time and consulting the right people at the beginning. And then it's like any big organization with lots and lots of busy people. If you ask the wrong bit, then you just get nowhere for quite a while until you've gone backwards and forwards quite a few times.
Well, we could imagine if this was maybe a few months ago, we could have done this as a bit more of a workshop. You could have presented initial findings and we could have had discussions. So yeah. But I was also just going to finish. We've got kind of 5 minutes left, but we can probably wrap up a bit early. But I was just going to finish with one last question, saying kind of what can EPIC do on this topic? We like our mission statement is kind of about understanding delivery challenges, supporting our members with best practice on those delivery challenges, and advocating for implementation-minded policy. And I think environmental inspections kind of cut across all three of those areas. And I wondered if, doing your report, did you think there were any obvious avenues that need kind of further research that kind of a community of practice like EPIC would be well placed to support with, or anything like that?
Rob, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, I mean, I'd certainly say that I think a lot of regimes that local authorities focus on, I mean, the impression we've got from this, they are in some senses or have been in some sense a little bit neglected, at least sort of in terms of how the legislation works for them. Often legislation can be a bit older and it's not necessarily sort of targeted as well as it could be. So, I mean, I think, an organization like Epic, I think, given that you've got the kind of on the ground experience for how these things play out in practice, it's very good to be able to link up how the legislation translates into the real world and see how that actually plays out, and then be able to explain how the legislation might work better, because obviously that's a big part of what we as the OEP do. We're very interested in trying to make sure that the legislation actually works. So of course the sort of significant on the ground experience, particularly in regard to regimes that local authorities are responsible for implementing, is so valuable for establishing whether or not the regulations and the law works in the way it should. So I think that's definitely an area that it would be really, really good, that potentially Epic could be really, really valuable for.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, there's more and more emphasis on environmental outcomes. We're not supposed to be just making policy and writing reports. We're supposed to concern ourselves with environmental outcomes, which actually, the OEP has always been rather strong on. But I think this sort of event is hugely helpful for us because, again, we're not just writing the report for fun, but we're just writing it to deliver. To try and deliver slightly more efficient, slightly more effective environmental regulation. And, we're very, very keen to learn from the practical experience, as Rob has said, of people like yourselves and your members. You've got a huge amount of sort of know-how on the ground about how these things work or don't work, and we'd like to get the benefit of it. So we should keep trying to explore ways to work together, and to make sure that you're aware of research projects and report writing that we're doing, so that you can say, well, hey, we could have some input to that and help steer it and help inform it.
Yeah, really cannot state strongly enough how much, it's all very well, we can sort of understand what the law should be doing in theory, but this report really reveals how, when you're actually engaging with the people who make it happen in the real world, that extra layer of understanding of how it works and whether it works, it's really hard for us to get that otherwise. So that is so valuable.
Yeah. Well, that's brilliant to hear. Thanks both very much. Okay, excellent. Oh, actually, I just remembered one thing I was going to say off the back of that as well, is that Epic is currently about to publish a guide to local authority environmental implementation. So that might be interesting reading for the both of you.
Definitely.
So yeah, maybe I can send you an early copy of that or something like that. And for everyone else, that's going to be published on the 13th of October, at the same day as the Epic conference. And yeah, if you're an Epic member, then you'll automatically be notified and get an email about that. Great. Well, we are 1 minute to 1, so I'm going to bring it to a close. But thank you so much both for presenting, and obviously thanks for producing the report in the first place. William, I know you said you weren't doing it just for fun, and I know a lot of blood, sweat and tears has gone into it, that it's not just for fun. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks very much everyone for attending today, and for putting questions to our presenters, and for taking time out of your day to come. As I mentioned in the chat, you will automatically receive a recording of this at some point today, and then also it will go on the IES YouTube channel in the coming weeks if you want to share it with colleagues and things like that. But yeah, just thanks again to our speakers and to our attendees, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.